Hello, everybody. Can you hear me now? Is that good, Bill? Yep. Hi. Nice to see and hear you all. I'm Mark Hughes, the faculty director of the Kleinman Center here at the University of Pennsylvania. Very happy to have you all joining us today from the Fisher Fine Arts Building, the library, where we're privileged to have our offices. I'm actually standing in the office that our guest today is virtually occupying. It's our visiting scholars office. I'm going to step aside so you can get a quick view of College Hall, which I'm sure you have missed as much as we have for the last several months. Today, we're going to talk about the topic of residential electric heating and cooling. As we've often discussed here in this ongoing conversation, the energy transition leans heavily into the policy strategy of electrification to realize decarbonization goals. And electrification is an accumulation of many thorny problems overcome at the nexus of technology, policy, and markets. And a very important one is how we electrify our buildings, and residential electrification of heating and cooling is a key part of the many puzzles that need to come together and fit just right in order to achieve our ever increasingly ambitious goals in the context of climate change. And we have today a global leading scholar on this set of topics. Kleinman Center is privileged to have as a visiting scholar Lucas Davis as our guide to explore these thorny issues. Lucas is the Jeffrey A. Jacobs Distinguished Professor of Business and Technology at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. He's also a faculty affiliate of the Energy Institute at Haas, co-editor of the American Economic Journal Economic Policy, and a faculty research fellow at NBER, at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research focuses on energy and environmental markets, and in particular on electricity and natural gas regulation in competitive and non-competitive markets, and the economic and business impacts of environmental policy. Now, before I hand over the mic to Lucas, I just want to mention that we are recording this event. The recording and the slides will be available tomorrow through the miracles of Kleinman Center efficiency with my amazing set of colleagues here. And I encourage you to submit your questions for Lucas via the Q&A function. We won't be using the chat function for questions. You're free to chat amongst yourselves. We won't be monitoring that very carefully for questions. So use Q&A and start doing that now during the course of Lucas's opening remarks, which will last about 25, 30 minutes or so, leaving about as much time afterwards for a conversation. And I will moderate those questions and look forward to getting started. So thank you. And now, Lucas Davis.
Thanks so much, Mark. Delighted to be here to talk about what matters for electrification, evidence from 70 years of US home heating choices. Can people see my slides and hear me? Perfect. So this is a working paper. It's up on my website, so you can, if you can read it carefully, if you want all the gory details. I would just say I'm very much welcoming feedback today. This is a working paper, so I'm out trying to learn as much as I can, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. The motivation is that US households burn vast amounts of fossil fuels on site each year for space heating. 2.7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, large amounts of heating oil and propane as well. This is a lot of CO2. So this is, in term to try to put it in some kind of perspective, this is the carbon dioxide equivalent of having 40 million cars on the road. So if you're looking at sources of carbon dioxide emissions in the United States, this is one of the major sectors that come to mind. And this is why policymakers are increasingly interested in electrification. So this really, Berkeley, California, where I sit today, was the first city in the United States to ban natural gas for new buildings. This happened on January 1st, 2020. San Francisco followed suit later in 2020. And today, 43 cities in California have either banned natural gas or they've instituted electric preferred building codes. This is a lot about California. There's a lot going on in California. In addition to these cities that have banned natural gas, we've also instituted state-level building codes that have a preference for electric heating. So there's a lot going on in California, but this is not only about California. Cities in Washington, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island have similarly instituted natural gas bans or instituted electrification codes that prefer electricity. On the other side of the spectrum, you have states like Arizona, Oklahoma, Missouri that have passed or have introduced statewide prohibitions against such local measures to block access to natural gas. So we've gone from nobody talking about building electrification to everybody talking about building electrification. There's discussions about building electrification at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. So why? Why are we talking about building electrification? If I was going to summarize, if I was going to try to say what's the most important trend in energy markets over the last decade, I would point to a chart like this. So what this chart shows is levelized costs for grid scale wind and solar electric generation by year since 2009. And you see that in terms of levelized cost of wind, it's fallen from above $100 per megawatt hour in 2009 to below $50 per megawatt hour in 2020. This is a 71% decrease, very large decrease in terms of levelized costs. In terms of solar, levelized costs since 2009 have fallen from above $300 per megawatt hour to below $40 per megawatt hour, a 90% increase. This is just a staggering development and has vast implications for how we power our world. I just as a quick anecdote, I was here in Berkeley, and Al, when I've actually been a UC Berkeley professor during this entire period, this 10-year period. I actually arrived at Berkeley in 2009, and shortly after I arrived, Al Gore came to campus, and he was talking about. He was as he has been for a long time, he was incredibly enthusiastic about grid scale wind and solar, grid scale renewables. And he actually talked about at a lunch we were able to attend, talked about how he thought costs were going to continue to decline rapidly. He's very enthusiastic. So part of me, I wanted to share his enthusiasm, but I really never in my wildest dreams, for example, thought that solar was going to go from above 300 to below 40 in the period of 11 years. It turns out that these cost declines have even exceeded Al Gore's wildest dreams, right? So this is an incredible decline in cost. This puts wind and grid scale wind and solar PV on par with combined cycle natural gas and other forms of fossil fuel electricity generation. Okay, so this is a big deal, and it's leading us to think not only about transforming the electric grid. Right. This means we can substitute out, say, we can replace coal with renewables in the electric grid. So there's a lot of obvious excitement and momentum in terms of decarbonizing the electric sector. But it also means, well, now that we've got this clean, cheap electricity, it's leading us to look around and say, what else can we do with electricity? And that leads us to building electrification and electrification of transportation. Those are the two big sectors, right? So it's not only that this is kind of a hopeful area. I would say that this is what we're counting on if the United States is going to rapidly decarbonize. I brought in a chart here from a recent Princeton study that asks the question, how is the United States going to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050? So this is a forward-looking analysis, and they're thinking about different scenarios by which the U.S. could get to net zero emissions by 2050. And what's striking about this is that all of the scenarios they consider, and they say there's a couple different paths we could go on, but they all involve large-scale electrification of vehicles and buildings. It's not just this Princeton study. In the paper, I cite another 3 studies that perform similar scenario type analyses. Every person who sat down and said, how can we get the US to net zero emissions, concludes that we've got to rapidly decarbonize buildings. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got a lot of excitement. You've got proponents arguing that electrification is critical if the US is going to sharply reduce CO2 emissions from the building sector. In the other corner, there are critics arguing that electric heating costs more than natural gas. So electrification mandates like this are expensive and regressive. Remember, there are a handful of states that are dug in against this kind of a policy, like banning natural gas. Okay, so this is getting a ton of policy discussion, but so far, very little economic analysis. So what I wanted to do with this paper was to begin to look at this question from an economic and then also from a historical perspective. So one of the things that I very quickly found was really missing from this discussion was history. I pulled the data that you see in front of you that I'm going to talk through in detail. But I've actually never seen anyone pull the data exactly like this. I've never seen anyone document this trend. I was actually pretty shocked when I first constructed these maps. But what's missing, I think missing in the policy discussion today is that the US is already electrifying buildings and that there's been an incredible trend towards the use of electric heating over the last 70 years in the United States. I think this is not widely recognized. I'm an energy economist. I've actually studied natural gas. I've studied electricity markets. I wasn't aware, frankly, of the degree to which there's been this transformation towards electric heating. Now, nobody was talking about decarbonizing in 1970, right? So this is not because of any kind of a policy aimed at decarbonization. Nonetheless, I think it's just critical that we understand this trend if we're going to build efficient policies to continue to move this trend along. Okay, so let me show these maps now in a little more detail. Let me go back to 1950. And so what this shows is the percentage of US homes in 1950 that were heated primarily with electricity. And the answer is in 1950, this was very rare. Only 1% of US homes were heated primarily with electricity. By 1960, it was 2%, so still very little electric heating. Notice that the Pacific Northwest does pop up here. This is not a coincidence, and this is a trend you're going to see even in the later period. Hydro, cheap hydroelectric power, and actually this comes through out here too. Cheap hydroelectric power. I'm going to be telling a story here, and part of the story is that places that had access to cheap electricity because of hydropower were more likely to embrace electric heat. By 1970, 8% of US homes were heated with electricity. This is still a small percentage, but this is 8 times as many homes as 8 times the percentage that it was in 1950. You're seeing not only the West, but also you're seeing the Southeast by 1970 emerge as an area with a lot of electric heating. 1980, 18% of US homes were heated with electricity. 26% of homes are heated with electricity in 1990. And look at Texas, look at the entire Southeast. By 1990, electric heating is becoming the dominant form of heating in the Southeast in the United States. 30% by 2000, 35% by 2010. And by the last year for which I'm going to be analyzing data in my analysis, 39% of US homes heated with electricity in 2018. Includes 60% of homes in Texas. Over 90% of homes in Florida are heated primarily with electricity. So I think this is really interesting. And I mean, I think a lot of times in the policy discussion, it kind of the idea you kind of evoke this image of a place maybe like Berkeley, California, where there's not a lot of electric heating to start with, and we're really trying to completely transition the sector. And that's really not the case, right? The real case is more nuanced. There's a lot of parts of the US where there's already a lot of electric heating. Of course, there's others where you don't have a lot of electric heating, and that's going to be the story today. So I want to ask 2 research questions. I want to ask what explains the increase in electrification of US home heating since 1950? And then I want to ask how much would households be willing to pay, a little economics jargon here, to avoid an electrification mandate? And as a preview of my results, I'm going to find that several factors matter. I'm going to have 5 hypotheses for why you have more electric heating today. But it's going to turn out that changing energy prices is by far the largest single explanation. This is just going to come through incredibly strong when I let the data speak and try to ask the data what is driving these choices. Energy prices are by far the largest single explanation. Geography, climate, and housing characteristics matter too. Income doesn't matter very much. And then in terms of willingness to pay, and this is really going to the economic cost of a mandate like this, right? Economists, the way an economist would think about this is that when you take away a choice, that's what a mandate does. A mandate takes away a choice. That's going to make households worse off, right? Households would prefer to have the full range of possible choices. You take one of my choices away, I'm going to be made worse off. But how worse off am I going to be made depends on how strongly I felt for my preference. So what I'm going to find using an economic model is that households in warm states are close to indifferent between electric and natural gas heating, so would be made worse off by less than $300 on average annually. But households in cold states are going to tend to strongly prefer natural gas, would be made worse off by $1,000 plus annually. I think this makes some intuitive sense when you think about the trade-offs involved. But my study is I'm just going to put a flag down here. My study is the first to document and try to explain this pattern. And it's the first study to try to measure the economic costs of an electrification mandates. So this is pretty new. I am going to try to connect it to the existing literature. There have been previous economic analyses of home heating, but they tend to be from well before this period in which we're talking about decarbonization and asking very different research questions. I'm also going to connect to a literature that asks, how responsive are people when they use electricity to price? Whereas the literature has tended to look at very short-run responses, I'm looking at really very long-run behavior. So I'm looking at how, say, a price today is going to build in choices and capital that's going to affect how you use electricity and other energy sources years or even decades from now. I'm also going to connect to literatures about energy efficiency and building codes. But then lastly, one of the big takeaways from the analysis is that pricing matters, that getting prices for energy right is incredibly important. And that's going to come out of this analysis, but that's a very familiar and favorite theme in a large literature in energy and energy economics. There's a lot of studies going back a long time that talk about how important it is that we get energy prices right. Okay, let me jump right into the analysis. The core data set for this is a household level data set with home heating choices that's compiled based on 5 waves of the US Census and 10 waves of the US American Community Survey. What's a very important feature of all these surveys from my perspective is that they all ask the question, which fuel is used most for heating this house? So this allows me to construct this essentially 70-year repeated cross-section of households making choices about home heating. Also from these data sets, I'm going to know household income, age of the home, and home characteristics. I'm going to pair this data with a 70-year panel of residential energy prices that I construct from a variety of different sources. I'll show that data in a minute. Also, data on climate. I'm going to be measuring climate using heating degree days, which is a widely used measure of the total amount of heat you need in your home in a year. That's going to come from NOAA. I'm going to merge all these data, but then I'm going to restructure them to examine choices at the time homes are constructed. So I'm really thinking about this choice as being made at the time that you construct the home. And I'm doing that for 2 reasons. So first, there's just a lot of inertia with these choices. Sure, you can retrofit your home later, but there is a lot of inertia and there's a lot of evidence that whatever you put in initially, whether it's electric or natural gas heating, for example, there's a lot of inertia. For one, it's a large capital expense to go back later and retrofit to be equipped to a different heating system. So I think understanding those initial choices is very important. And the second reason I think it's important to think about time of construction is that, at least for now, most of the policy in this sector is aimed at new construction. So I'm really going to be looking at new construction here. And I'm going to use I'm actually going to use, from each of these surveys, I'm going to use homes that were built within 10 years of the survey. So for example, to describe the 1950s, I'm going to use the 1960 census. To describe the 1990s, I'm going to use the 2000 census, et cetera. Okay, let me show you some data. This shows US average residential electricity prices by state. And I've labeled the 4 most populous states, but you actually see the series for all 50 different states. I think it's really interesting. And I will also just say that all prices and income levels in the paper are in real year 2020 dollars. What you see is that electricity today is cheaper than it was in 1950. It's actually gone down by over 50% in real terms. Electricity is cheaper today. And it's really dramatic in some states. This orange series is Florida. In real terms, electricity in 1950 cost over 30 cents per kilowatt hour. Today, it's less. Today, it's about 10 cents per kilowatt hour, so about a third of what it cost in 1950. It's a pretty similar pattern for Texas. Other states, electricity is more expensive. There's been a lot of ink spilled on why California has such high electricity prices. New York also here has high electricity prices. But even in these states, it's lower than it was in 1950. So this is we think this is really interesting pattern. It shows a lot of time series, but also a lot of cross-sectional variation with a lot of variation in prices. Here's residential natural gas prices by state. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. You have a long period of regulation, price deregulation, a ramp up in prices, and then hydraulic fracturing that pushes natural gas prices down by the end of this. Again, a lot of time series variation and a lot of cross-sectional variation in residential prices. Heating oil, as you might have guessed, is going to have a lot less cross-sectional variation. But it does have some time series variation following closely crude oil prices. So this is some of the variation that I'm going to be able to use to estimate the model. Okay, so the first hypothesis is energy prices. The second hypothesis is geography. And what this map shows is the change in the distribution of population in the United States since the 1950s. Okay, this is a little confusing, so I'm gonna give you a specific example. Texas had 7% of new home construction in the 1950s. So if you look at the United States, Texas was 7% of new home construction in the 1950s. Today, it's 16% of new home construction in the 2010s. Actually, I wrote a blog recently about how no state has built more new homes since 2010 than Texas. And so that's a percentage change over this period of 130%. So Texas has a higher fraction of new homes today than it did in the past. That's also true for states like South Carolina, Nevada, Utah. They have more new construction today than they did in the past. Meanwhile, states like New York, Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois, largely these states up here, have a smaller fraction of new homes. So if you look in the 1950s, we were building a lot of homes in those states. In the 2010s, we're not building a lot of homes in those states. This change in geography can help explain why a larger fraction of Americans today heat with electric heat. Why? Because electric heating is better suited to states like Texas and South Carolina, even Nevada, warmer states. There's economies of scale with heating. Electric heating systems are very inexpensive in terms of capital costs, more expensive in terms of operating costs. So they make more sense in a place like Texas, where, with the exception of last February, you generally do not need to use a lot of heat. Okay, so that's geography, and I haven't quantified this yet, but I'm hypothesizing that this can help explain the increase in electrification. Just to put that in terms of numbers, in the 1950s, 19% of homes in the United States were built in the Northeast. That falls to 10% in the 2010s, falls in the Midwest, increases in the South. And that's really this increase in new homes in the Southeast is what I'm going to be after here. Okay, third hypothesis is climate change. On average, the United States has experienced a 10% decrease in heating degree days since 1950. That is, households experience less extreme cold. They need less heat than they did in the 1950s. In terms of absolute change in heating degree days, The units are largest up here. The bit changes are largest up here in the north, where you were starting with a very large number of heating degree days. So with essentially a 10% decrease, that's a larger decrease in units. Even in Florida, it's getting warmer, but it's from a smaller base. Okay, I want to hypothesize that this pattern can also help explain electrification, because as climate change occurs, electric heating becomes more desirable for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. If you need less heat overall, it's easier to make an economic argument for electric heating. Okay, I'm not going to show you all my descriptive statistics. You can look in the paper if you're interested, but I wanted to just highlight a couple others. Household income since the 1950s has almost doubled in real terms. So it was 61,000 on average in 1950s, 106,000 in 2010s. That's a huge increase in household income, and I hypothesize that that can affect electrification choices. There's also been changes in housing characteristics. There's not a kind of a very simple trend here, but there tends to be a decrease in home ownership, an increase in the percentage of homes that are multi-unit, and an increase in building size. That's going to be the fifth hypothesis, is housing characteristics. Can that help explain electrification? Okay. So I know you guys appreciate gory details, but I'm going to go pretty quickly over this. But I think these are interesting enough regressions. I just want to spend a minute on this. What I'm showing here are 6 regression specifications. In all cases, the dependent variable is an indicator variable for whether a household chose electric heating. And this is estimated with a sample of 4.2 million households that based on this data set I described earlier. I'm going to estimate a variety of models that identify these parameters using different forms of variation. So some of these are going to include year fixed effects, but some aren't. Some are going to include different geographic fixed effects, but some specifications aren't. And this is important. I'm happy to talk more offline about why I think it's important to see how these results change with different forms of variation. But let me talk through what the results are saying. The most striking result in these regressions is what happens with prices. So across specifications, there's a large negative relationship between electricity prices and electrification. I want to talk about what this minus 0.42 means. So what this means is that, for example, a 10% increase in electricity prices decreases electric heating by 4.2 percentage points. This is a very large effect. For example, in 2018, residential electricity prices ranged from 9.6 cents in Louisiana to 21.6 cents in Massachusetts. That's a difference of 0.8 log points. The model implies that, everything else equal, an increase in electricity prices of that magnitude would decrease the percentage of homes with electric heating by 32 percentage points. So it looks like in this model, electricity prices matter a lot. Natural gas prices and heating oil prices matter less, although there is a pretty robust positive cross price elasticity with natural gas. Also, as we would expect, as natural gas prices go up, that pushes people to electric heating. Somewhat surprisingly, income matters very, very little. In the paper, I show more significant digits so you can see what this really means, that it's a very small effect. It actually corresponds to a $100,000 increase in annual household income, decreases the probability you choose electric heat by only 2 percentage points. So income, kind of contrary to my expectations, doesn't matter at all. The other variable that matters a lot is heating degree days. This is a large effect. What this current heating degree days in Minnesota and Florida are 8,000 and 600 respectively. So everything else equal, this coefficient implies that if you go from Minnesota to Florida, you'd be 47 percentage points more likely to choose electric heating. So this is a large effect too. I'll skip these in the interest of time, but it turns out that housing characteristics matter in the expected direction, but actually are going to end up not being important enough to explain a large fraction of the increase in electrification. Okay, in order to quantify this, I want to do some counterfactual analyses, and I'm gonna do this is the way it's going to work. I'm going to go back to 1950, and well, first let me tell you what this black line is. The black line is the percentage of new homes in each year that are heated with electricity, and it's exactly similar to what you saw in the data earlier. As time goes on, a higher fraction of new households are choosing electricity. and then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to 1950, and I'm going to hold energy prices fixed at 1950s levels. Then I'm going to let all the other characteristics, geography, climate, income, housing characteristics, all that stuff's going to be allowed to change over time, but I'm going to hold energy prices fixed. And I'm going to use my model to predict the fraction of new homes that would be heated with electricity. When you do that, you get this orange line. These two lines are very far apart from one another. And what that's saying is that energy prices explain most of the increase in electrification since 1950. That's going to be the big takeaway from the model, that energy prices matter a lot. Geography matters too. If you go back to 1950 and hold fixed where, remember in 1950, we were building homes in places like Michigan and Ohio. If you hold that fixed and then run it forward to 2020, you end up having less electrification. But the gap here is small compared to what happened with energy prices. Housing characteristics matter some too. This is largely because we build more multi-unit homes in 2020 than we did in 1950, but it's a relatively small effect. Climate matters in the expected direction, but it's a small effect, and income has almost no effect. To summarize, what explains the increase in electrification since 1950? 82% energy prices, 7% is geography, this changing distribution of where people live or where new homes are built. 4% housing characteristics, 4% climate change, and then household income actually takes you the other way, but essentially has no impact at all. So bottom line, energy prices matter a lot. And that warms my heart as an economist. And actually, it underscores the importance of some recent work that my colleague Severin Borenstein is doing with UC Davis professor Jim Bushnell, called "Do Two Electricity Pricing Wrongs Make a Right?" So what Severin and Jim do is they say, they ask the question, is electricity efficiently priced in the United States? And what they find is that electricity is way too expensive, even accounting for externalities. That's this social marginal cost. Dark blue means that electricity prices are too high. They're higher than social marginal cost. In contrast, there's other parts of the US, largely where we use coal for electricity generation, where electricity prices are too low. What my model would say is that these mistakes in pricing, this inefficient pricing is having a really big impact, and it's leading people to make the wrong choices in terms of home heating. We have too little electric heating in California and too much electric heating in these parts of the US that are red. Okay, much more quickly, I'll just at a high level summarize the results of the willingness to pay analysis. Again, the research question there is, how much would US households be willing to pay to avoid an electrification mandate? There's not going to be a methodological contribution here. I'm going to use a very standard discrete choice model used for this analysis. The reason I need a discrete choice model is it's not just that I want to predict choices now, I actually want to use a model to measure economic cost in the form of willingness to pay. So I'm going to do this with a discrete choice model. This is a more forward-looking analysis because I'm really looking at, I want to answer the question today, what would willingness to pay be? So I'm gonna use just the newer data. To estimate this discrete choice model, I'm going to just use homes built since 1990. All the results are in the paper, and the flavor of the results is very similar to what you saw in the linear probability model. But what this allows me to do is to make predictions about heating choices as like this. And the model does a really good job fitting the actual choices that are made since 1990 in the United States in terms of percentage of homes heated with electricity. But it also allows me to measure willingness to pay. So here's the results from the second half of the paper in one slide. And what this is it's the average willingness to pay to avoid an electrification mandate. So what this is saying is that how much worse off is a household made on average when they're told they can't use natural gas. In a state like Florida, an electrification mandate is not expensive. In fact, I find that average willingness to pay in Florida is under $100, or it's just about $100. That makes sense. Households in Florida already are happy to use electricity. 90% are already choosing electricity. So on average, an electrification mandate is inexpensive. It doesn't impose large economic costs. Texas is about $300 on average. California, it's about $800 on average. Pennsylvania, it's about $1,100. As I head north, as I head to places with more heating degree days, we get to larger willingness to pay. And there's even some very cold parts of the US where households would be willing to pay on average over $1,500 to avoid being subject to an electrification mandate. What that means is they really prefer natural gas, right? They would really, they're saying, I'm going to be made much worse off if I'm told I can't use natural gas to heat my home. Okay, so I'll tell, and then I'll open up to now to questions and your reflections. Is this a glass half full, or is this, is the glass half full, or is the glass half empty? One implication of this research is that nationally, it may be a lot easier than is generally believed to encourage electrification. I haven't seen this talked about very much, but this trend is already happening, right? Absent any policy, we're moving towards more and more electric heating. That suggests it may be a lot easier, particularly in warmer parts of the country, to do building electrification. Moreover, the analysis identifies millions of additional households, mostly in warmer states, for whom adopting electric heating would impose relatively modest costs. There's millions of homes that are going to be built over the next decade in relatively warm states. It wouldn't take much of a policy push to push those folks from natural gas to electricity. On the other hand, the analysis also underscores the significant lift it would take to electrify cold states. Think about Minnesota. That's a big lift. That's a place where it's very expensive to heat your home with electricity. And that's also where the vast majority of emissions come from. So that's the glass half empty part of this. I'll be interested to see how you guys interpret these results. With that, let me thank everyone. Put up my favorite, the takeaway figure 1 from the paper. Thank you. And if you aren't able to get a question in today, by all means, my email's on my website, and I'd love if you could follow up with questions or additional ideas. Okay.
Thank you very much, Lucas. We've got a lot of questions queued up for you. Also, with an assist from our colleague, Arthur Van Bentham, I've got a summary of some things that have been going on in the chat that I think is worth addressing as well. Let me start with the very first question from Arthur, which is because it's kind of a baseline kind of question about, just in broad terms, how much cleaner is electric heating exactly compared to natural gas, say, in particular, in either carbon and or dollar terms?
So if you're a PhD student looking for a dissertation topic, I think that would be a fabulous topic. I think there would be real synergies with recent work that's been done for electric vehicles. So there's a paper by Stephen Holland, Aaron Manser, and co-authors in the AER that does this for electric vehicles. And the big finding from that line, there's actually a couple of papers by this group of co-authors. What they've found is that the answer to that question varies by location. And so if you're in a place like California, where your electricity is coming from relatively clean sources and almost never coming from coal, then moving from natural gas to electric heating is a big win in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. If your electricity, on the other hand, if your electricity is coming largely on the margin from coal, and I'm looking at you, the Midwest, then electrification in 2021 actually doesn't make isn't a great argument for decarbonization in 2021. Now, proponents of electrification would say, and they'd say this both about electric vehicles and about building electrification, that 2021 is one thing, but we're building the capital stock today that's going to be with us in 2030 and 2040. So we need, even if it's maybe not a great win in terms of carbon today, we need to be doing this because of what's going to happen in the future. And there's a strong argument there. There is huge inertia in these building systems. This is largely analysis about new buildings, but retrofits are really expensive. The capital costs are enormous, but the operating cost impacts are enormous too, because older homes tend to be less well insulated. So you're going to use a lot more heating, whether you're using electric or natural gas. It's a lot more BTUs of heating. So it's a tough, if you're living in a drafty farmhouse in Minnesota, moving to electric heating is not cheap.
That's great. Yeah, there's about 3 or 4 directions to go out of that answer related to bundles of questions in both the Q&A and the chat. let me try to hit all of them. Let me start with this one. Speaking of location, with your focus on heating today, even though I know your larger concern is both electric heating and cooling, is there a possible effect in terms of adoption, say in the southeastern states versus say California, that is to say the hot and humid climate as opposed to the Mediterranean, that in the South, what you're seeing in addition to maybe some Tennessee TBA electricity type stuff, and also some fewer heating degree days, it's also the simultaneous purchase of electric cooling, especially with increasing efficiency from heat pumps. That's part of this. Is that, have you disentangled some of that stuff?
I'm so glad you queued that up. Let me just first say, so heat pumps is another of these things. Nobody was talking about heat pumps 5 years ago. Now everybody's talking about heat pumps. And just in terms of baseline setting, traditional electric heating is known as resistance heating. And that's just like having a toaster in your home. You're using electricity to create heat, right? You're converting electricity into heat. That's resistance heating. A heat pump is a fundamentally different technology. You're not creating heat, you're moving heat. And a heat pump can be really thought of as an air conditioner running in reverse. And amazingly, even in a cold winter, a heat pump can be taking what little heat there is outside and bring it into your house for heating. And why would you do that? Because that's much more efficient in terms of the amount of electricity you need to use per BTU of heating. That's more efficient than resistance heating. And so 10% of Americans today heat their homes with heat pumps, but it's overwhelmingly in the Southeast. And if you look at new homes being built, for example, in Texas today, a large number of them use heat pumps. In part, it's because because the capital costs are low. Because as you suggest, Mark, you're gonna put in a central air anywhere, any central air conditioning anyway. The incremental cost of doing a heat pump instead is pretty low, and so you go ahead and go with that. You have a heat pump. Now, a recent analysis by Columbia University finds that except for the Southeast, heat pumps are not privately economic in most of the rest of the United States today. Now, the interesting question is what's going to happen moving forward? Could heat pumps become more energy efficient? And certainly proponents of electrification, proponents of heat pumps see this coming. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future, but if heat pumps could become 20%, 30% more energy efficient, now all of a sudden that really does change the economics in more moderate parts of the country. All of a sudden heat pumps can make more sense. And the last thing I wanted to say about that is that also actually creates an interesting entry point for retrofits, which is maybe we don't think about heating systems at all. Maybe the point in which we flip over a house is when they're replacing their central air conditioner. So when you have a house in Tennessee and their central AC goes out, you go in and we target subsidies that say, actually, don't just put in a new central AC. Go ahead and install a heat pump at that point, right? And so that's an interesting entry point for retrofits and deserves a lot more thinking and attention.
Everybody's going to think we've colluded here, but that's a great segue to another question around, and it goes in a couple of directions as well, your choice, around more on the retrofitting, but also I want to throw in a code question around this on that point as well, because in a way, it's our traditional designing of codes and enforcement of codes that leads to the big gap on retrofit, right, and on new construction. But I think that there's, could you adjust some of the details, some of the grain on the code variable? I've read a couple of examples of jurisdictions that are proposing the pre-installation at time of construction, right, of enough panel size or whatever to more fully electrify at some future date. Have you thought about that kind of option value in code?
I think yes, this can be done with building codes, and I see this as a way that is going to happen. This is already happening in California. I mentioned other jurisdictions that have implemented electric preferred building codes. I'm contractually obligated as an economist to say, I would rather do this with prices, frankly. I would rather us. I would rather, this is crazy, but could we at least move in the right direction with these prices? And there's an enormous discussion in California about how could we, and I think, people say, I know when people mention electricity rates, people start falling asleep, right? It's not something people love to think about, but electricity rates in California are really hampering my state's ability to de-electrify, to decarbonize, right? How do you get, on the one hand, we want people to adopt electric vehicles. At the other hand, we're charging people 35 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity. Those things just aren't compatible. So I would love, just first, I have to say, right, I would prefer to just get prices right, not only for electricity, but also for natural gas, and of course, heating oil and any propane, any alternatives, and then let people make the choices that are best for them. If we're not going to do that, though, I think then building codes make sense as a second best policy, and particularly when let me bring one more layer in here, particularly when you're thinking about new housing developments in places where there's really a question whether we're going to roll out new natural gas infrastructure. So imagine a new housing development in Philadelphia. Or do we really want to roll out new natural gas infrastructure? How long do we think homes in that subdivision are going to use natural gas? If we're trying to get them onto electricity anyway in the next 10 years, a building code can make sense as a coordination device and just say, let's move everybody to this decarbonized alternative. That can also have, I think, big potential equity gains. I have a different research paper with University of Michigan professor Katie Hausman, where we're looking at who will pay for natural gas infrastructure in a world where we have large number of households leaving the natural gas system. And unfortunately, we think this raises real equity concerns, because we think it's going to be largely higher income households who can afford to move to electricity, leaving lower income households left holding the bag in terms of paying for these legacy costs of the natural gas system.
As a taxpayer and ratepayer in Philadelphia, let me say here to that, right? Because it's exactly like mode defection in the early days of rooftop solar, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and so there's fixed costs in these infrastructures that somebody's got to pay for. And again, on that, there was an interesting question in the chat as well. And given your interest in natural gas, maybe you've thought about this. I don't know if you've started to kind of look at it yet, but in the context of the residential heating choices. Yeah. Any thoughts about how the strategy, the electrification strategy, and especially the residential heating and cooling strategy through electric equipment compares to some of the chat going on about alternatives to natural gas in the same pipes, with either some kind of blue or green hydrogen or ammonia or other kinds of things?
That's a good. I would guess that hydrogen would be the most important kind of alternative to think about. And there's a different Columbia University study on this, thinking about that trade-off. I haven't looked at it closely enough to say. My sense is certainly on the policy side, the momentum is really behind building electrification. But it's certainly we need a generic answer always when we talk about decarbonization is we should have a lot of smart people thinking really hard about all the different possible alternatives. And if there was really a cost an efficient, a reasonably priced green hydrogen, that could really change this discussion in terms of thinking about legacy gas infrastructure. All of a sudden, that gas infrastructure is not legacy. Right. I'll just say the one thing I do remember from this recent Columbia study is that the costs involved of retrofitting the existing natural gas system in order to handle this were enormous. Yeah. And so you'd really want to compare that to some of the costs like I'm coming up with here for thinking about what it would take to electrify. Yeah.
So another question, this is the one that draws on Arthur's kind of summarizing of some of the comments in the chat that we're running about the kind of imperfect information on the part of consumers about the costs and benefits of electrification. And how, if we, as Arthur puts it, if we leave the rational model, how could or might your findings kind of change? I would connect that question and this whole subject of imperfect information on the part of consumers about the costs and benefits to some of the prohibition on mandates that's going on in the red states, right? That where you've got this kind of intermediary, right, legislatures acting on, acting legislatively, but basically to send and help build a perception about costs and benefits, right? That tries to institutionalize some of those perceptions and so on. I mean, any thoughts on, there was a lot of interest in the chat about, about your kind of deployment of the econometrics of the imperfect information and so on. A lot of interest on that.
Hey, Udi, I'd be interested to know what Arthur would have a thought about this too, because he's worked exactly in this area. I guess whether you're talking about a heating system or a car, these are intertemporal choices in that you're making an investment decision today that's gonna result in changes in how much the thing costs over a long period of time. So I say that's intertemporal because you're trading off $1 today for $1 tomorrow, right? And my reading of the literature is, yeah, there are some studies that have reached kind of a different a mixed answer on this, but a lot of studies find that at least in the vehicle space, where we think have the most evidence, is that people actually make pretty good choices and they have a pretty good idea about how much about trade-offs between say fuel efficient and less fuel efficient vehicles. I kind of think similarly. I think households do a pretty good job of weighing private costs and benefits in these heating system choices. Now, you might have asked, well, is it the household making them? It may also be a builder or a contractor, or in the cases of rental housing, landlords in part making these decisions. But by one way or another, I'm finding that prices are mattering to a huge degree here. So certainly, this decision is being made with a lot of reflection on what the different relevant prices are. And I guess when I look at these data, I see mostly pretty good choices. Places where electric heating makes sense from a private perspective, I see a lot of electric heating. When I see natural gas heating makes sense, I see a lot of natural gas heating. I think if I was going to invoke one kind of behavioral economics theme, it would be status quo bias. And that's not about electric versus natural gas, but I would say it's about heat pumps that we talked about earlier. I do think, look, I think humans, we like to do what we've done in the past. If your tribe has never eaten that red berry, I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb to don't eat that red berry. Status quo, like we tend to not do different things than we did in the past. And I think that generally is a pretty good policy. But I think when in the case of new technologies, that can lead to slow adoption. And I do think there could be an argument for kind of helping people learn about and get over the hump with heat pumps to kind of embrace this. One way would be just to kind of obfuscate it. And what I mentioned that a lot of Texas homes have heat pumps. Well, when you look at the ads for these homes, and I suspect when you do the tour of the home, it doesn't say heat pump anywhere. It just says this home has incredibly efficient heating and cooling system, period. I suspect tons of households have heat pumps in Texas. They don't even know they have heat pumps. They just know when they turn the thermostat, they get heat. So, maybe that's another solution.
Well, and also, a late comment here by another colleague, Andy Humler. Where did it go? Oh, it just disappeared. Did it? It was talking about how, why did you edit that out of there, Bill? Oh, it's in the answer column. It wasn't because it wasn't a question. It's true, it was a claim, but I'm going to call it up because it's kind of consistent with what you were just saying there, Lucas, about FYI, Efficiency Maine has rebated 45,000 heat pumps in the state where there's, quote, 9 months of winter and 3 months of rough sledding. Right?
Yeah.
So the maybe one last question, depending, I guess, on how long your answer is. I can't do the econometrics in my head fast enough, but do you see a pattern between your kind of efficiency pricing map, right, and your kind of legislative activity on either the local prohibitions of new gas infrastructure or the state prohibitions on those prohibitions? Is that Is there a connection there?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think I think there is a correlation. I think the Pacific Northwest is kind of that doesn't behave according to that correlation. Because for the most part, what you see is the places with expensive electricity, i.e. California and the Northeast, they're the places where there's action towards forcing people to use electricity. And in a sense, that makes, I actually think that's more correlation than causation, that they also just tend to have different policies along a lot of dimensions. But in a sense, there's a logic to that, because if the rates aren't going to do it, and believe me, 35-cent per kilowatt hour electricity prices in California is not incenting people to go out and install heat pumps. If you can't do it with prices, I guess then you do it with code. So you force people to do that. Now, I mean, what my results would say is that is not zero cost. I find that households in California would be made worse off by about $800 on average by an electrification mandate. So it does make people worse off, largely because electricity prices are so high, but it does achieve a carbonization goal. Is it free? No. Is anything free in decarbonization? You know, I'd love to find it if it was. Maybe McKinsey will tell you there's free lunch, but you know, I find most everything is expensive, and this is no exception.
Right. Excellent. Fantastic. So interesting. Okay. Well, we're about out of time. I'm going to take this last minute to thank our visiting scholar. I wish you were sitting in the visiting scholar's office instead of me right now. It'd be great to see you in person again soon. Thanks very much for a terrific talk. You know, you had a concept per minute density that was equal to the very best we've ever had. The slides and presentation both will be available tomorrow to hear more on this topic. Tune in to our podcast next week for a conversation between Lucas and our host, Andy Stone, on this topic. And during Climate Week on September 20th, we'll be having our next event, which will be a panel discussion on EVs on campus. Thanks very much, Lucas. It's great to see you. Appreciate the work so much.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks, everybody.